Buongiorno, my name is Teresa de Fazio and I come to you from Australia and I am on Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation. I acknowledge the first peoples of the land and pay my respects to elders past and present. My presentation, and I'll share it with you now, is on a particular initiative we have. It's quite new at the university, and it's called New Horizons. I'll just give you a very brief background. The university is very multicultural. It serves a low sort of socioeconomic area of Melbourne, typically a settlement area for migrants and refugees. Represented by, as you can see, the data there, we have quite a big representation of non-English speaking and non-English speaking as well as English speaking only students at the university, and this is collected through voluntary data that students fill in on their enrolment. We have a cultural diversity strategy. This is new, it's in its third year at the moment, that is driven by cultural diversity principles and goals. So this gives you a bit of a background, very sort of short background into the university, because I would like to focus on the asylum seeker and refugee students who we have represented at the university. This is an indicative sort of outline of the countries where they come from, and of course we know that ethnic groups within these countries and faith groups within these countries vary. So a bit of background. We noticed that we have asylum seeker refugee students, and we know that typically asylum seeker refugees have quite a number of challenges to settlement, and these that are listed here would not be any different to a refugee's trying to settle in any country, and I'm sure you're familiar with these issues or these challenges. You know, there are gaps in skills, and of course these are probably the ones that are more nuanced. For example, in Australia, you can't become a police officer unless you have a swimming qualification. So the ideal is to come to Australia to settle, and often that settling means obviously getting a job, and often that means studying to open up the door to employment. But there are systemic barriers to employment, and these are listed there. We need to name that, you know, unfortunately there is also one of the barriers is discrimination, and they are exposed to exploitation because the asylum seeker refugees either don't know their rights or just accept what they can in order to live, and there are a range of other systemic barriers. So we know that by the time we see them at our university, and I must point out that our university is one of very few at the in Australia which is a dual sector. That means we have the vocational or technical and further education part of it, as well as the university. So together we have those two sort of sections, which is great because it means if students come into the vocational education, they can actually pathway into the university should they wish. So lots of opportunity there for these students. But if we look at the students coming in, often, as I said, coming in to gain employment or re-qualify in order to gain a position and to help them with their settlement, we find that there are difficulties. Now, the university, as I said, is made up of two areas, and the vocational education area is funded by the regional or the state government. So in Victoria, that government will assist through some subsidies to the students who go through vocational education. However, the universities, those students are subsidised by the university itself. The federal government, the Australian government, does not provide any support whatsoever. So they come through on an international student, as international students, and the price is high. It is too hard for an asylum. In fact, it's impossible. Therefore, through grants and scholarships and philanthropy, we provide, if we look at Maslow's, plotted against Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we sort of provide the survival in a sense. So it opens the door to education. And once there, of course, there are a number of services that they can access. So asylum seeker refugees have access to counselling, to career advice, to extracurricular programs, to volunteering. In terms of social needs, there's a range of them available at the university, clubs, societies, events, all sorts of ways that they can become involved. Esteem needs, as we know, are absolutely important in terms of settlement, especially for asylum seeker refugees who come with a range of rather negative and very difficult backgrounds and experiences. But we have leadership programs, we have employ some as students and staff, so a range of programs and awards that they can tap into. But self-actualization, of course, after many years of study, means that they would like employment. Of course they would. So graduation, but then what? And as I explained, there are some key challenges on the part of our employers in hiring or recruiting asylum seeker refugees. From their perspective, they don't quite understand what is in it for them, the business case for hiring refugees and asylum seekers. They may recruit in response to social responsibility programs, but then that's it. They recruit and then the asylum seeker refugee just has to sort of I suppose fit in, and it often it's great, but there can be some issues, and we can talk about those later. Employment often is at lower levels, and one might say, is that a bias? When they have all these qualifications but are doing employment which is at a much lower level for them. Employers, with all the goodwill in the world, become befuddled and confused about the complexity of visa types and the documentation. It gets all too hard and they just don't want to know. It is tricky. The documentation is tricky. And with all the good intentions, they may find that there are health and well-being issues, especially if the asylum seeker or refugee has unattended trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder issues. So their employers are concerned about integration issues and the time involved to work with asylum seeker refugees and the resources that would need to be required. So now, knowing all of this, we looked at what was happening for our students, and this is a newish program. So we're looking at it and we're going, okay, on one hand, we've got these students, the asylum seeker refugee students, wonderful. We have a big organization in the university, and we've got on the side a whole lot of partnerships. Universities often work with employer groups of, all sorts of employer groups, water suppliers, gas suppliers, people who come and clean, or people who are constructing, or people who come and want to work with our researchers to develop concrete sort of chemistry, or all sorts of things are happening around the university. It's a really big place. So we've got these pieces of the puzzle, it's time to put them together. And what we decided to do is, rather than disturb those employer partnerships, we brought in a number of organisations who know and work and specialise in working with asylum seeker refugees and understand all of that, and understand, very importantly, the paperwork, and can be a touch point. So almost case managers for this program. So we, my office, a team works very closely with the broker. We introduce them to our employer partners. So we do a lot of this sort of work beforehand. We introduce them to the brokers. Then there's a conversation which doesn't disturb the core work of the university, nor does it disturb the core work of the employers. So that's retained. The student has the experience of being employed, and the case managers use their expertise in a very, very valuable way. The findings of this particular model means that, as I said, there's a safe space. The asylum seeker refugee experts in the community who work as case managers or brokers come in. We find and do a lot of the sort of work around the documentation and flagging any issues, etc., if need be. We find that employers become very curious, and they become very curious, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that, and how they become curious to understand more about asylum seekers, refugee situations, and diversity and inclusion in general. We find that not only do the students develop and have an opportunity in terms of that self-actualization, which was part of Maslow's hierarchy, but it also happens in the employer organizations, and there's quite a beautiful thing that happens there. And this introspection, both individually and as an organization, influences workplace culture, and often develops into a really nice sort of theme around inclusion for the organization. We all learn about communication and key messaging and what each needs to hear, and each needs to be able to understand in order for this program to work. The business case that the employers want, it begins to unfold in front of their eyes, and they feel much happier about their commitment. In fact, it's a one-year commitment to the program. What happens is that they then start talking about it to other employers, and it's been a really interesting sort of unfolding that is happening. Also, what happens is the organizations have started to talk about wanting more, wanting to understand and skill themselves up more. So have come to myself at the Cultural Diversity Office to ask for intercultural training for their employees, or asked if they could become mentors. So their level of engagement has increased. And what is interesting is that the program then becomes collaborative, it is inclusive, it becomes authentic, and leads to deep level change. And I'll just wrap up, with Maya Angelou's saying, a bird doesn't sing because it has an answer, it sings because it has a song. And this is what this program is all about. You'll see the lovely faces of our asylum seeker refugee students who have gone on to graduate from law and from hospitality and from engineering and from health sciences. We have a paramedic here. So all sorts of wonderful outcomes. So I'm looking forward to sharing some more insights with you, and meeting you across Zoom, even if not in person in Milan. Thank you.